Okay, so let's leave it. Let's leave this thing about the albumin print and all, and let's go on to this thing called the carbon print. But before we do, I have to reiterate that we're going to talk about carbon prints, we're going to talk about platinum prints. The albumin print completely dominated photography in the 19th century. Don't forget that. I spent a lot of time on these other obscure processes, but 90% of the prints made in the 19th century were albumin prints, looking just like these on the wall here. Silver is the only material that makes compounds that are sensitive enough to record the light coming through a lens. Now, if we make a contact print of a negative, we have the paper we're contacting printing onto and the negative sitting here, and we can have a huge brilliant light source. And light can be coming from all sorts of directions through the negative, and we can plow tremendous illumination through that negative to the print. When we're in a camera, the film or plate only records the light from each point discretely, so very, very little light gets through a lens. And so we have a huge difference in illumination level between what we have in a camera and what we have making a contact print. So while silver is the only thing that's usable in a camera, when we get to contact printing from negatives, we have a whole bunch of other processes that work that don't involve silver. And yes?
Early on, you said one of the two major things was that the issue of blackness. I think you said that right in the beginning. And yet the albumin, and I see some of these where black is not as important.
Well, I didn't mean it quite that way. What I meant is that one of the key issues is that ink that we print with is black. And we have the struggle of figuring out how to break it up into little particles to portray tone, to emulate tone. But it's interesting, Alan, in room 1 and in the first part of room 2, you know, I had lots of blow-ups of the processes. We've got into photography now, there's hardly any. Because there's no particles. It's smooth tonality, there's not much to see. But it's true, it's true. There isn't the black of black ink in these early photographic processes. They all are much weaker than that. They get black again when they become books and when they become the dry plate in the next room. So there were two big categories of non-silver printing processes. One category is that based on iron compounds. We're going to come into that in the next room. The other is the category based on the hardening of colloids by exposure to light. Now, a colloid is an animal polymer, gelatin, a gum arabic out of trees. What else is there? Well, those two are good enough for now. There's another big one that I'm not remembering, doesn't matter. There's a fish glue that's an animal polymer. And these are materials which can take up water, they can soak up water, and they can become a jelly. You can heat them up and melt them. They can become a liquid, and then when they're cool, they'll reset back into a jelly. And they're tremendously versatile, and the one that is used predominantly in photographic printing and photographic negatives in the 20th century is gelatin. And gelatin is what happens to the horse when the horse goes to the glue factory. You know, we've all read about that, the poor horses. And it's this clear, colorless material that's made by boiling down animal parts. You can buy it, does a Knox company make it? I think Knox gelatin, right? In little packets, maybe 15-gram packets at the grocery store. Well, the great process based on gelatin for printing is called the carbon process. And these are samples all starting here with this one running all through this corner. It's the photographic process that had the most accurate tonal description of anything. More accurate than the albumin, more accurate than any modern materials that we have. And I have to describe the way it works in detail because it turns out to be part of how we make photogravures, which we come to in room 4. So I have to go through it carefully. So the way a carbon print is made is it starts with a piece of paper, a thin piece of paper, a nice, even, smooth piece of paper. And this piece of paper gets a coating of heavily pigmented molten gelatin. The gelatin is melted in a vat with water. It's actually soaked in water and then heated up. And then pigment, artist pigment, is sprinkled on it. Usually a little bit is put on a glass plate and some gelatin is put there and the pigment is sprinkled and it's ground in with a thing called a muller, which is a thing with a big handle and a flat base made of glass. And this pigment is worked into the gelatin. It's very, very laborious. It's done by machine now. The pigment in the beginning was carbon black. Carbon black is a carbon compound you get from burning a gas flame with inadequate oxygen. We've all seen that dirty black smoke coming off a candle sometime. And it's been produced as a pigment for many, many years, and it was the original pigment for carbon printing. So you mull tons of this pigment into the gelatin until you get this hot, gooey, stinking, solid black mass of molten gelatin with pigment in it. And you put it in a tray, and it's liquid because it's hot. And this piece of paper is rolled onto the surface of the tray. You can imagine putting one end there, taking the other end and bringing it down like this, and the sheet gradually rolls onto it. And then you pull the sheet off, and it has a beautiful layer of this black stuff stuck on it, and it runs off. And when it runs off and drips off the bottom, you end up, in fact, with a beautiful, thin, wedge-shaped coating of gelatin with pigment stuck on the sheet. And as it cools, it sets up very quickly. In 4 or 5 minutes, it sets. Of course, it's shaped like a wedge, right? Because it's thicker at the bottom because it was running off. So once it's set, you turn the piece of paper around and you roll it on the other way and hang it up. And you get a second wedge going the other direction, so you get an even coating. So this is an absolutely pitch black sheet of paper, and the minute it dries, it tries to curl up, spring, because it's only got a coating on one side. You know, this is this terrible thing about coating one side of a piece of paper. But you let it dry, and after it's dry, it's time to make a print, you get a tray of potassium bichromate or ammonium bichromate dissolved in water. It looks like Kool-Aid. It's bright orange, absolutely deadly if you happen to drink it. And it has to be cold water. And you cut a piece of paper that's going to be the size of the print, and you unroll it and push it down into the bichromate, and it gradually loses its curl, and you soak it there for 3 or 4 minutes. And then you pull it out, so you now have this black sheet of paper that's dripping orange Kool-Aid from it. And you take it over and lie it down on a piece of chromed steel. We used to call them ferrotype tins. They were in all the photographic labs. And you squeegee it onto this piece of this ferrotype tin and stand it up in the corner and blow a fan on it. And gradually the fan dries it and it pops off, and you have this brilliant, shiny, smooth, perfect black sheet of paper. Okay, now this is weird for me to describe. It'd be much easier to do it in a demonstration. Usually we buy the carbon tissue with the black pigment on it, so we can avoid that part of the procedure, and we can just buy this roll of the stuff and cut it up and soak it in the bichromate. We have to dry it against this tin, this thing called a ferrotype tin, to give it this perfect polished surface. It's necessary for it to have that, for it to expose properly. When it's dry, we put it in contact with the negative and expose it to sunlight. And what the sunlight does is it hardens the gelatin, because gelatin in the presence of a bichromate becomes hard when it's exposed. And gelatin that's not in the presence of a bichromate and exposed remains soft and soluble in water. So if we imagine it without a negative, imagine that I have this piece of sensitized paper, solid black. I cover half of it, expose it to sunlight, take it out, put it in hot water. The unexposed half will wash off. And I'll have a blank sheet of paper and half of it will be black. Does this make sense? Because I've exposed half of it. But now suppose I expose it to a negative. The light goes through the negative. Where the negative is thin, it hardens it to quite a depth. Where the negative is thick, it only hardens it a little. But I can't put it in hot water, because if I put it in hot water, all the soft stuff underneath will dissolve and the picture will float off and go down the drain, right? So instead, after I expose it to the negative, I put it in cold water, put another sheet of paper in there, get them together with no bubbles, take them out, turn them over, put a pile of books on top to press them together for half an hour. They stick together like a sandwich. Then I put it in hot water. The soft stuff melts. I peel off the paper backing, and the picture is stuck to the new piece of paper. So this is a transfer process. In other words, I expose the gelatin while it's on the carbon tissue. That's what we call the paper. And then after it's exposed, I stick it in cold water to another one, and I melt the unexposed stuff off, and I get a picture. So a couple of interesting things happen. The first thing is the picture's reversed, because I flopped it over. The second thing that happens is that where it's been exposed heavily, the gelatin layer is thick. Where it's only exposed a little, it's thin. And where it's thick, the black pigment makes it look black. Where it's thin, the black pigment is a light gray. So I get a variable thickness in the gelatin, but I also get a corresponding variation in tonality. And that tonal scale is the best of all the photographic scales we've ever had. It's the best because we can make it a very, very thick layer of gelatin with a lot of the bichromate, which is the sensitizer, and we don't have any limit as we have in silver papers where there's not enough silver. We have no limit, and we get a beautiful straight line response tonally from the material. I'm glossing over a complicated technical thing there, but the tonal scale is absolutely beautiful. So the interesting thing is that if we're in a shop and we make a carbon print, we can't have a reversed picture. So we then have to put it back in a tray of cold water, and we have another piece of paper that has a different coating on it, and we stick them together, and then we take it out and we put it back in another bath and we peel off the other piece of paper. So we transfer it a second time. Now, I've never transferred one a second time. I can just barely get through doing it one time, right? I have to say. But this carbon print is absolutely incredible when you consider that somebody's gone through that procedure, exposed it by contact to a glass negative that big, and then done a second transfer. It's absolutely unbelievable that it's possible. But you can see here, the pigment is a little purple. Here it's green. Here's a remarkable pair where there's a brown pigment for one and a green for the other, made from the same negative. It's very, very interesting. Here's a carbon print of a Raphael drawing in which the pigment is the same red chalk that was in the chalk that Raphael made the drawing. Now that's really cool that that can happen. The carbon prints have a whole bunch of characteristics. One is that they curl terribly, and you have to glue them down. This pair is quite remarkable because nobody ever glued them down. And I think if we look at an angle, yes, when we take a break, everybody's to come over here and look at it like this, and you can see that there's a real ripple to the sheet where the thick gelatin layer on the back is making it pucker up. The other characteristic of it is that no hypos involved. So the prints are completely permanent. They're as permanent as the pigment. The other characteristic of it is that it can be any color. All the photography we were talking about before had a color that derived from the chemistry of the materials used to make the print. Here, it's about the pigment. We can use a red artist pigment, a green pigment, a brown pigment, a purple pigment. It's tremendously versatile. The difficulty with the carbon print is that it was a bitch to make. It was very, very hard and demanding to make. And you had to go through all that procedure to make one. You could make as many as you wanted, but you had to do it again and again. So it was very, very demanding. So carbon prints were very expensive, not because they used silver, but because of the labor. They were made big because they were made as art reproductions. And you find a lot of them, you find pictures of insipid paintings that are carbon prints. They had a portfolio in one museum I went to of Julia Margaret Cameron albumins, and one was an albumin and 6 were carbons. So people have made copies with them, putting pigment in that was purple, that looked like an albumin print. Yes?
That one there looks like it's meant to be like an albumin.
It's meant to look like an albumin, that's right.
Why would they do that with such a complicated process?
Well, they do that because purple pictures were real pictures. See, that's what all the pictures were purple. And everybody knew that was a raw photograph. We really get to that in a minute with this crazy process. But I'll talk a little more about it. But it's because purple was accepted as the color of photography. So the carbon was a luxurious system. There was a set of photographs of the, what is it called? The closes and streets of Glasgow by J. Craig Annan, right? Did J. Craig Annan do it? I think he did.
Or the son.
Oh, no, it was his father did it. The father did it, and I've forgotten his first name. And it was a beautiful presentation. What was it? Thomas Annan. It was a beautiful presentation album of carbons, and there's one in Doris's collection that's come to Yale. And there were maybe 2 or 3 copies of this. That's a funny noise, isn't it? Well, whatever. It's a machine, we'll ignore it. But then they also made a second edition in photogravure, cheap and inexpensive. Photogravure being the most expensive ink process, you know. So it was the cream of the crop, the carbon print. But it was hard to make. Oh, that's a terrible noise. No, wait, it's all right. What are they doing?
It's hard, it's scissor lift.
Oh, okay, it's leaving. It's leaving. Okay, it's gone.
Wait a minute, it's not.
I don't think.
Mayo, do you have a question? No, it's okay. We'll ignore it.
Besides sun exposure, can you control the exposure? Because the sky is so perfect, exposure is so
loading or like?
Yeah, no, it's an interesting question. There's no contrast control with the carbon print. It has one response scale, and the only way you can control it is by controlling the negative, the density of the negative. This is not made from a camera negative. The camera negative was an 18 by 24 centimeter. That was contacted to a glass to make a glass positive. That was enlarged to make this enlarged negative, and they could control the contrast of the negative perfectly to make the print. But there's no contrast control. They contacted to make a glass positive. Yes, that's right. So the carbon was absolutely beautiful, but it was high dollar. But it had a derivation called the Woodburytype, which is the ultimate crazy photographic process. And it's so crazy you just can't believe it. And I have such pleasure talking about it. We have a Woodburytype here of Darwin. We have another one of a piece of sculpture somewhere, I don't know where. This is a painter in France. He's glued onto a piece of paper that has letterpress halftones of his paintings in the background. This is a theater bill. This is an enlargement of this guy's mouth. The Woodburytype is actually a casting of a carbon print. And I have to describe exactly how it's made for it to make sense. But imagine that we make the carbon tissue, and imagine that instead of making the carbon print on a piece of paper, we make it on a sheet of glass. So we stick this thing on a piece of glass, and the glass is extremely clean. And if you can imagine, once it's developed, where the picture is dark, the gelatin is thick. Where the picture is light, the gelatin is thin. You remember, because I just said this, right? If we then take that piece of glass and put it in a hydraulic press, where the back is extremely clean, and lay a sheet of lead on top of it, and press it at 10,000 pounds per square inch, the lead takes on those variations in height that the carbon print had as it sat on the sheet of glass. We can then take the piece of lead out, turn it upside down, put it on the bed of a press, flat. We can melt gelatin and pigment, mold them together, just like making a carbon print, and we can pour it into this lead mold. And if we pour it in the mold and lie a piece of paper on top of it and squeeze it so it squishes everything out that's excess and chill it, we can then open the press and pull out this casting of the carbon print, and it's called a Woodburytype. Now this is like the first person who ate an oyster. Who ever decided to try it? I mean, Mr. Woodbury, talk about being out there. But it turns out that once you make the lead mold, it costs almost nothing to make another print. And you can have a press mounted so that one person is loading the press, squishing it out, and rotates and chills it, and another person's peeling them out, and you can mass produce the prints. So the Woodburytype was a system by which you could mass produce variations on a carbon print. We're going to ignore the squealing machine, right? Yeah. But it's very interesting. If I look at these Woodburytypes here, Jock, I'm getting back to your point, they're all purple. They look just like albumin prints. And that's because with the Woodburytype, you really were trying to trick the public. Because the Woodburytype was the cheap imitation photograph. It was on a theater bill. It was in the Galerie Contemporaine, which is the People magazine of the late 19th century. It was on pictures of famous people, and they were almost always printed purple so people would think they were albumins. Now, it's very hard to identify a Woodburytype. One thing I can say is they're much more common than carbon prints. And they're never big like a carbon print, because it was impossible to make that lead mold much bigger than about this. So you never find big ones. They're always glued down. And they're always glued down because when the glop was squished out, it ruined the borders. So that the borders had muck on them, so you had to trim it. So they're always glued down, and they're often used for theater bills because they were so cheap. And this is a perfect example. And this is another one where you can look at it at an angle. Please do when we stop. And look at the light reflecting off it, and you can see that it's all ripply from the different depths of the gelatin that's stuck on the paper. The carbon print that was the source for the Woodburytype had a longer scale than the regular carbon print, so the depth was increased. But if you put a micrometer, the difference between highlight and shadow is less than 1,000th of an inch. It's really extraordinary.
It relates to the pantograph?
Say it again?
It relates to the panther measured the thing this way?
Oh, yes, but this is so minute, Alan. The variations of this are tiny.
Tiny of it.
Tiny, tiny. So the Woodbury types are fascinating. You still can find Woodbury types. They're still relatively cheap. I think maybe 6 months ago I found a 5-volume set, a biography of Disraeli on eBay, and each book had 4 Woodbury types in it, and I bought the set of 5 for $300, which is dirt cheap. It's really amazing. So they're still around, and they're almost always purple, okay? And don't anybody ever try to make one. Although there's a nutcase, a wonderful guy named Barrett Oliver in California who's making them now. They're pretty good too. Okay? Then we're going to finish with this. These are called the pigment prints, this corner. We're going to finish with the gum bichromate print. And the gum bichromate print is another pigment process where a piece of paper is coated with pigment that's in gum arabic. And it also has the characteristic of being sensitive to light if it's sensitized with the bichromate, and it will harden. It's a terrible, terrible process because you brush this gloppy, sensitive coating onto a piece of paper, dry it, expose it, and then instead of transferring it to make a beautiful print, you put it under running water and rub it. And if it's on a piece of watercolor paper with a little tooth, you can rub it and the highlights will wash away and grind away and the shadows will retain. And it's perfect if you're making these stupid photographs that characterize the area of pictorial photography. It's perfect for them. Now, when I wrote about it in the book, I called it a dog shit process. And the editors were very sweet. And finally, the last note I got from the editor just before we finished is he said, I really think we have to do something about the dog shit. And so we took it out of the book. But it's a dog shit process. It's just awful. And this is it at its best. This is a French one from about 1910, and it's a pictorial photograph. It's really very, very good. And this is one out of the museum collection of Edward Steichen. And Steichen used it a lot, but he often put a gum print on top of a platinum print. So he had the beautiful tonality of the platinum with the gum exaggerating the shadows a little bit. So we will leave this section, but let's remember that albumin was the king, and we have these 2 other systems that made pictures not using silver. This corner is one. It's the pigment print, and we're going to go to the other much more interesting corner, which is the iron corner, which is in the beginning of room 3. Okay? The terrible light is here because of this print. This print is part of the museum's collection. It's, of course, a contact print of a thin slice of a cadaver. And they don't know who made it. They found it somewhere, and there's a bunch of them out on the market. Some poor soul was chopped up in little tiny layers and contact printed. So, but it turns out there's a whole bunch of iron compounds which are sensitive to light. And one of them, ferric ammonium citrate, is absolutely dirt cheap. You can buy it for almost nothing. You can dissolve it in water, brush it onto a piece of paper, and it dries sort of yellowish. You can expose it to light. It darkens a little bit. You can then wash it with water, and it turns into a brilliant blue. And it makes a blueprint, and it's dirt cheap, and it's really quite stable. This one is particularly bad. Most blueprints will last years and years and years, even with a lot of exposure to light. This is what they were really made for. This process was really figured out for making engineering drawings. And you have to realize that's a negative, right? That started as a black line drawing on a piece of paper, and it was contact printed to make a blueprint. If that coating that's blue had been made by silver, we would have had to spend a fortune just to make a set of blueprints for an even small piece of construction. But the blueprint was so cheap we could get away with it. So the Empire State Building and the battleship Missouri were all made with blueprints that were made with this iron process. It disappeared at one point. It was replaced by a dye process called diazo. And the diazos looked just like blueprints. And I'm even a little fuzzy about when it changed. I think it was in the 50s. And the diazo was a thing that was exposed and processed in the machine and came out the other end without any work. These things were all brushed on by hand or coated in a big factory somewhere. But if you were a photographer of limited means, you could make beautiful photographic prints by blueprinting. Now, fancy people in museums call them cyanotypes. Now, there's a problem here with names, right? if somebody's trying to sell a silkscreen, they call it a seriograph. If they're trying to sell a blueprint, they call it a cyanotype. And if they're trying to sell an inkjet print, they call it a giclée print, right? This is this totally corrupt system of naming. It's really absolutely appalling. And I made a real point of calling them blueprints. And I've heard people walking through the show say, why don't they call them cyanotypes? You know, although they did call them that in the 19th century, I have to say. So it was used by people for postcards. This is a beautiful little postcard from a set, and clearly the person had looked at Peter Henry Emerson's photographs. It looks just like an Emerson, but it's a blueprint. This is a picture of my paternal grandmother when she was a teenager. Who knows who made the picture, but it was with a glass plate and they cracked it. It was with a dry plate, which we'll get to on that wall. This is a charming but very dark blueprint of a lady with a 4x5 view camera, which is kind of cool, sitting out on a field somewhere. And this is a picture of a coaster schooner, which my grandfather took. He spent years and years in the summers in a little boat with a 4x5 camera photographing shipping in Narragansett Bay. None of the yachts, but only the shipping stuff. This picture is probably 1880, something like that, 1890, and here it is in absolutely perfect condition. The total scale of the blueprint is pretty good, but the problem with it is the goddamn thing is blue. And if we think purple was tiresome, blue was really tiresome. So it hardly ever was used as a fancy art process. I think Curtis made blueprints. I think there was somebody named Anna Adkins who made blueprints. I think a few other people, but really it wasn't used very much by anybody who was a real serious artist. But it had a cousin, which was another iron process, which ended up being called platinum printing, which was the king of the non-silver processes. Oh, was it that was carbon the king? Carbon was king, platinum was the queen. They were the two great ones, right? And this is a wall of carbon prints, actually of platinum prints, this whole wall running from one side to the other. It uses a metal called ferric oxalate. And when I was younger, I used to remember the formula. I think it was Fe2C2O4-3? I don't remember it. 4? Is that what it was? I just don't remember it. I used to know it, you know, I used to know all the chemistry. But what happens with this ferric oxalate is you know, the material's cheap to buy. You dissolve it in water with a little oxalic acid and you make this sort of greenish liquid. And when it's exposed to light, if it's dried on a piece of paper, when it's exposed to light, the ferric oxalate changes to ferrous oxalate. This is a great big change. It's an electron jump in the shell of the iron atom. And it makes a chemical that behaves completely differently. So if you coat the piece of paper with ferric oxalate and mixed into the coating is a platinum salt, mixed in together, so by this time the coating is kind of yellow. You brush it on. You expose it to a negative to sunlight, once again, just like the carbon print. And then you process it by putting it in a solvent, which is called potassium oxalate. The minute the solvent hits, the ferrous oxalate turns the platinum salt to metallic platinum. And the ferric oxalate doesn't do anything. So you immediately get a perfect print. It develops instantaneously. Boom. And then you don't need to fix it in fixer. You can give it a light hydrochloric acid bath. It takes away the ferric oxalate, and you have an absolutely clean, perfect print. And it's not purple. It's neutral. Neutral to slightly blue, but it's really neutral. And it's completely matte surface. So by this time, this is 1877, this comes along, photographers have gotten tired of the fact that albumins are purple, and they've gotten tired of the fact that they're shiny. So they're desperate to have a printing system that is neutral and matte, and the platinum print supplies that to them. It was invented in 1877 by a man named Willis. Now, through the perversity of all artists, as soon as platinum came along, they tried to figure out how to give it color. So they started developing into different things to make it brownish. This is a platinum that's been developed with a little mercury developer to give it a warm tone, trying to make it look like the thing they detested, the albumin print. And then when Alfred Stieglitz got his hands on it, he would wax them to try to make them shiny like the albumin print. So it's completely irrational what artists do. But the fact of the matter is that platinum is a spectacular process that's very, very easy to do in a kitchen. And I'm going to describe exactly how it's done, just to show you how simple it is. You either buy the dry chemicals, or today you can buy a bottle of the dissolved chemical that has the ferric oxalate in it. It's perfectly easy to do with the dry chemicals. And you have it in a little bottle with an eyedropper. And then you have another little bottle that has a little bit of dilute potassium chlorate in it. It's kind of hard to buy that because it's what the weathermen used to make bombs with in the 60s. So when I was young and doing it, it was very hard for me to get a hold of it, but I got a pound at one point. And you just use a little bit. And then you get another bottle that has a platinum salt in it, dissolved in the water. And each one of them has an eyedropper in it. And if you're doing an 8 by 10 piece of paper, you go out and you put into a little cup, you put 24 drops of the sensitizer. Then maybe you put 2 drops of this chlorate that controls the contrast. Then you put 24 drops of the platinum, and you mix it up, and you pour it on a piece of rag paper, and you brush it on with the brush, and you dry it with your daughter's hair dryer, and you have a perfect piece of paper in 5 minutes ready to expose. And you expose it to the sunlight for 8 minutes or 10 minutes, bring it inside, pour the developer on it. Instantly you have a perfect print, if you're really good at it, if you've exposed it correctly. And you clear it in an acid, wash it, dry it on a rack, and you have a beautiful print. There's just nothing to it. It's very easy to make a really second-rate platinum. It's hard to make a really good one because the contrast is very hard to control, and the negative has to have just the right contrast. But it's something you can do extremely easily at home, and you do it all in a room with light like this. So you get out of the terrible dark room and you're working where you can see what's going on.
Very toxic.
What, say?
Very toxic. You don't want to do that.
It's very hot?
Very toxic.
Oh, no, it's not. Well, photography is toxic. All of photography is toxic. So I think if you're worried about toxic things,
You mean the image?
do something else.
You mean the image or the process?
The image can be toxic. The chemistry is toxic. That's right. But I have to say one funny thing about the platinum print, and that is that it has a reputation of having the most beautiful tonal scale. And it's simply not true. It's just not true. It's on matte paper. The black is always kind of weak. The fibers of the paper mess up the shadow detail, so that it has this myth that it has this beautiful tonal scale. I mean, no one can accuse these of having a decent tonal scale, right? I mean, they're very interesting pictures. This is an Irving pen, and it's great, and he's made the negative exactly correctly, and it's exposed beautifully. So, and this is Lois Connor. She still works today with platinum. These are both made with banquet cameras, funny cameras made for photographing groups of people that are long and horizontal. Lois has carried a 717 all through China and photographed, and Penn has a 12 by 20 banquet camera that he made that with. The interesting thing is that there's 2 metals that work with ferric oxalate. One is platinum and one is palladium. And there's a palladium salt, just palladium chloride, and it makes a much more beautiful black than the platinum, but it's brown. And so most platinum prints have a mixture of palladium and platinum in them, and it controls the degree of warmth of the print and the intensity of the black in the print. Jock Reynolds, do you notice I got that Yale picture in that you gave me? Isn't that nice to see there? A nice Yale. You wouldn't know that, you might know a Yale would have a platinum print for their, they were quite expensive because the metal is expensive. So this is a Harvard graduating class and the Yale Daily News board right next to each other, which I think is pretty good. There was a very funny thing that happened when I used to make platinum prints, which is that the price varied radically of the platinum. And I tried to find out, and at one point I talked to a chemist, and he said, it's because the wheat harvest changes in Russia. I said, what are you talking about? And he said that what happens is that Russia has the world's biggest stockpile of platinum, and palladium too. And if the wheat harvest is bad, they have to sell their stockpile in order to get money to buy wheat from the West, and when they sell their stockpile, the price of the metal goes down. So I used to look and see how the Russian wheat harvest was doing.
Why were you making platinum prints?
I made it for 20 years.
Why?
Because they're beautiful, because they have a better scale than anything else. I even believed it. No, I made them for 20 years. I made that one of the gateway at Puerto Rico. It's a beautiful, 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 beautiful process, and it's a process you can do yourself. If you use an 8 by 10 camera, you can make platinums, and it's just wonderful.